The cold humming vent trembled in the silence as my daughter-in-law told me I didn't need heat at my age, her voice soft but sharpened like a blade. Still, I kept my hand on that humming metal, steadying myself instead of reacting to the chilling truth behind her smile. As the vent's cold draft crawled up my wrist, it felt less like winter and more like her permission to let me freeze in my own home. While I listened to that same hum, I finally heard what she'd been hiding. Care had never been her intention, control always was. The cold hum revealed the part of our relationship I hadn't wanted to admit. She'd mistaken my silence for weakness. That's when I decided, if she weaponized the cold against me, I'd use the truth to thaw every lie she built around my name. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. I felt the cold first in my fingertips. It crept in the way Minnesota cold always does, quiet, confident, like it knows it will win. I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders and adjusted the way it tucked under my legs, but it didn't do much. The living room felt like it had swallowed a knot of winter air and refused to give it back. The furnace hummed, but the warmth never reached me. It was a strange sound, steady but ineffective, like someone whispering, "You'll be fine," while watching you shiver. Hannah's voice floated in from the kitchen, too bright for the hour, too sharp for the mood. "Heat costs money we don't have, Maggie. You don't need the house that warm at your age." She said it like she was offering friendly advice, the way someone might mention a sale at the grocery store. But the implication hung there, heavy as the frost gathering on the edges of the window. Jacob stood behind her, leaning one shoulder against the fridge, arms crossed. His eyes didn't meet mine. "Mom, she's not wrong. Bills went up again. We're just trying to keep everything manageable." Manageable, a word people used when they didn't want to admit something was already slipping through their fingers. I didn't argue, I rarely did. It was easier that way, and after 72 years I'd learned that silence can protect you better than confrontation. So I only nodded and kept my blanket around me, pretending it was enough. But the cold had a way of making honesty unavoidable. My breath clouded faintly when I exhaled, inside the house. Something was wrong. I waited until Hannah turned back to whatever she was adjusting on her endless list: budget sheets, schedules, chore rotations, things she believed made her a responsible wife and daughter-in-law. Jacob followed her out of the room, their footsteps fading up the hallway. Only Lee remained. She sat across from me in the armchair she'd claimed as hers since she was little, a faded blue seat that once squeaked until Jacob tightened the bolts one summer. She had a book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. Her eyes moved from me to the thermostat on the opposite wall and then back again, her expression softening with that quiet worry she inherited from her grandfather. "You cold, Grandma?" she asked, barely above a whisper, like she didn't want anyone else to hear her caring. I smiled. "A little, but nothing I can't handle." Her brows pulled together the way they always did when she knew I wasn't telling the full truth. She closed her book and stood, brushing her hair behind her ear before crossing the room. She stopped at the thermostat and stared at it for a long moment before turning slightly toward me. "Did you set this?" she asked. "No, sweetheart." She didn't touch it, but I could tell she wanted to. Maybe she'd expected to see a malfunction, a flickering screen, something mechanical. Instead, she saw exactly what I had: numbers far too low for January in Minnesota. I forced a gentle tone. "Leave it be, I'm okay." She hesitated, then stepped back, folding her arms around herself. She was cold too, it was in the way she kept shifting her weight, rubbing her sleeves. A gust rattled the window, the kind of rattle that tells you the temperature is dropping fast. After Lee went upstairs, I slowly rose from the couch. The blanket fell around my feet as I made my way to the thermostat, touching the plastic casing with my knuckles first. Cold. The numbers stared back at me, unchanging, unwavering, deliberate. Not an accident. Not a malfunction. A choice. The realization settled in my chest, heavy and unwelcome. Someone, likely Hannah, had decided that comfort was optional for me, that my age made warmth negotiable. I adjusted the dial one notch higher. Nothing changed. The furnace kept humming its hollow tune, failing to push out even a breath of heat. My eyes narrowed, my pulse tightening in a way I hadn't felt in years, not fear, not anger, but clarity. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't a Missundee. Our standing. This was control. And as I stood there in the dim glow of the hallway light, a deeper question formed, slow, deliberate, and colder than the air around me. If she's willing to limit the heat, what else has she decided I don't need? The thought landed hard. And that was the moment, quiet, icy, undeniable, when I realized something far more dangerous than winter had settled in my home. By morning, the cold had settled into my bones like it meant to stay. I woke before the sun, the house still dim, the air sharp enough that my first breath felt like inhaling glass. I lay there for a moment, listening, no movement upstairs, no creaking floorboards, just that same weak hum from the furnace trying and failing to keep up. I didn't need another hint. I pulled on my robe, slipped my feet into the wool slippers Lee gave me last Christmas, and made my way to the kitchen. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the cold, and I wrapped them around a warm mug of tea before picking up the phone. The utility company answered with the practiced cheer of someone who had been speaking since dawn. I explained that something felt off with my heating plan, that the house wasn't reaching the temperature it used to. The woman on the other end paused longer than necessary. "Mrs. Phillips, it looks like your service tier was changed last fall." "Changed?" I kept my voice steady. "By whom?" Another pause. I could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. "It was approved by a family member listed on your account." I didn't need a name, not after last night. When the call ended, I sat there at the kitchen table, staring at the condensation forming on the inside of the window pane. A thin film of frost traced the corners, delicate but undeniable. Hannah hadn't just adjusted the thermostat, she'd restricted the entire heating plan, quietly, confidently, assuming I'd never question it. She underestimated how much a woman learns after a lifetime of swallowing her reactions. By 8, I had already found the number of a local handyman, a man Gloria had mentioned once when her pipes froze 2 winters ago. He answered on the second ring, surprised but agreeable, and promised to come by later that afternoon to install a portable backup heater. "Just something reliable," I'd told him. "Nothing fancy, I just need control over my own warmth." After the call, Lee slipped into the kitchen, her hair still mussed from sleep. She studied my face the way only she does, careful, observant. "Is it still bad?" she asked. I nodded, "But I'm handling it." She didn't push. Instead, she pulled another blanket from the hall closet and draped it over the back of my chair, then set up the small space heater from the storage room near my feet. She tried to hide the fact that she was shivering, rubbing her palms together as she plugged it in. "You shouldn't have to live like this," she murmured. Her protectiveness hit me in a place I didn't speak about often, a place that remembered what it felt like to be looked after. Footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate. Hannah appeared in the doorway, tying her robe, her expression already forming the tone she planned to use. "What's all this?" she asked, eyeing the heater, the blankets, the phone still on the table. "I'm making sure I stay warm," I said simply. Her brows rose, not in concern but irritation. "It's a phase, Maggie. Winters feel colder as you get older, you'll adjust." Lee stiffened at the remark, her jaw tightening. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I could feel Hannah watching me, waiting for resistance, but I only offered her the smallest smile, the kind that lets a person believe you're harmless, even when you're already making choices they can't undo. By midday, the handyman confirmed he'd be here within the hour. I tidied the living room, moved a chair aside, and cleared a path for him to work. With every small preparation, a sense of strength returned, quiet but unmistakable, like a match burning in a dark room. When the knock finally came, I felt a flicker of relief. I opened the door and froze. Hannah stood behind me in the hallway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at the stranger on the porch. "What exactly," she asked slowly, "have you decided to do without telling us?" Her tone wasn't confusion. It was fear of losing control. And for the first time, I let her see that I wasn't afraid of her noticing. The handyman had barely packed up his tools and pulled out of the driveway when the house settled into a strange, brittle silence. Not peaceful, just tight, alert, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what Hannah would do next. I didn't have to wait long. The phone rang barely an hour later, its sharp tones slicing through the stillness. I was in the living room, adjusting the new heater's settings when I answered. Mrs. Phillips, this is the Winter Services Unit with North Valley Utilities. We're calling to confirm an emergency review request on your heating system. I felt Hannah's presence before I saw her, her steps soft but purposeful, stopping just behind the threshold of the room. She didn't interrupt, but her posture said enough, arms folded tightly, chin slightly raised, eyes narrowed like she was trying to read the words off my face. I kept my voice steady. Yes, go ahead. The caller continued, explaining that they'd flagged unusual restrictions on my account and would be sending a technician for an on-site inspection. Hannah shifted, a tiny scrape of her slipper against the hardwood. She didn't like not knowing what was being said. She didn't like that the call had come to me. When can they come out? I asked. We can send someone tomorrow morning. Perfect, I said, better safe than sorry. That line wasn't for them, it was for her. A small reminder that I wasn't planning to freeze quietly. When I ended the call, Hannah stepped further into the room, her smile tight enough to crack porcelain. Emergency review, she repeated, tone dripping with disbelief. Maggie, really? I like things checked properly, I replied, turning away from her to fold the blanket on the couch. The gesture wasn't necessary, but it gave her the back of my shoulders, not my uncertainty. Her voice thinned. You're making this a lot more dramatic than it needs to be. No, I said, just responsible. The air shifted then, subtle, but I felt it. A kind of retreat, not physical but emotional. She didn't blow up. She didn't argue. She simply pivoted and left the room, letting the silence finish her thought for her. A few minutes later, Lee came downstairs. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail and she paused halfway to the bottom step, studying me with an expression that warmed me more than the heater ever could. You're handling this, she said softly, almost in awe. I smiled at her, genuine this time. Some things are worth handling. She came to sit beside me, pulling her legs onto the couch, wrapping the blanket around both of us. Her trust pressed gently against my shoulder, unspoken but unmistakable. Dad thinks you're being stronger than usual, she said. He keeps saying something feels off. I could almost picture Jacob pacing the upstairs hallway, rubbing the back of his neck, trying to make sense of the tension he felt but couldn't identify. He was never good with subtle conflict. He always sensed the smoke long before noticing the fire. What did you tell him? I asked. That maybe things were finally changing. Her honesty settled around me like warmth. Later that evening, while I made tea, I caught Hannah watching me from across the kitchen, the way someone watches a dog that has unexpectedly growled, not afraid, not yet, but wary, testing distance. You've been busy today, she said lightly, her words coated with forced sweetness. Some days require it, I replied. She gave a laugh, short and brittle. Well, don't go overboard. We don't need strangers poking around our systems when everything is fine. Is it? I asked, not turning around. The silence behind me stretched long enough that I felt it more than heard it. Then her footsteps moved away, sharp and quick, her controls slipping 1 inch at a time. Just before bed, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Technician confirmed for 8:00 a.m. Please be home. And as I stared at the screen, the heater humming at my feet, a single thought clicked into place, a quiet, undeniable certainty. Tomorrow, someone outside this house would finally see what I'd been living with. And Hannah would have no way to stop it. The technician arrived the next morning while the sky was still a pale, icy blue, one of those Minnesota mornings where the cold feels older than the town itself. I heard his truck before I saw it, tires crunching over the frozen driveway. Hannah hovered upstairs, pretending not to notice, but I could feel her awareness in every creak of the floorboards. I opened the door before he had a chance to knock. Mrs. Phillips, he asked, breath fogging in the air. His name patch-read Evan, mid-40s, soft-spoken, the kind of man who looks at a furnace the way a doctor looks at an X-ray. Inside, he moved with careful attention, inspecting pipes, vents, the main unit in the basement. Every now and then, he let out a low hum, the kind that told me he'd found something he didn't like but wasn't ready to say out loud. I followed him down the stairs, my hand grazing the rail for warmth. When he finally straightened and turned to me, his expression was tight. "Mrs. Phillips, this system isn't just outdated. Some of the restrictions placed on it don't comply with current safety standards." A chill slipped deeper into me, not from the basement, but from the confirmation of something I'd suspected long before this winter. Before I could respond, footsteps descended the stairs. Jacob appeared, half awake, rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when he entered a conversation too late. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. Evan explained gently, keeping his wording technical but plain enough that even Jacob couldn't mistake the severity. "Unsafe, restricted, in need of immediate correction." Jacob blinked at me, confused. "Mom, why are you doing all this without talking to us first?" Because talking hadn't worked, because being polite hadn't kept me warm, because the quiet compliance they expected from me was never going to protect me. But I only answered, it needed to be done. Upstairs, Hannah's steps paused, then retreated quickly. I didn't have to see her face to know the color had drained from it. Evan glanced at his clipboard. "The good news is you qualify for a full system replacement under the Senior Winter Assistance Program, no cost." Jacob looked at him sharply. "What program?" "One your mother enrolled in months ago," Evan said. "Months ago, back when the house first started feeling colder, back when Hannah began managing more of the household decisions." Jacob turned to me, bewildered. "Mom, why didn't you say anything?" I didn't respond, not because I didn't have an answer, but because the answer would expose more than I was ready to explain in front of strangers. Silence, in moments like these, said enough. When Evan left to retrieve equipment from his truck, I stepped outside to clear my head. Frost crackled under my slippers. Across the yard, Gloria saw me from her porch and walked over, her coat barely zipped, coffee steaming in her hand. "You all right?" she asked, blunt as always. "Getting there." She studied my face, then nodded without needing details. "I'll help you put in smoke detectors and a carbon monoxide monitor while they're doing the install. If your heat's been messed with, I'm not taking chances." I didn't argue. I let her inside, grateful for her steady presence, someone who didn't question my choices, just supported them. By early afternoon, the house echoed with the sound of drilling and metal being shifted. Lee arrived home from school, dropping her backpack as soon as she saw the chaos. Her eyes widened. "Grandma, what is all this?" "A fresh start," I said. She stepped closer, worry threading her voice. "Why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" I met her gaze, gentle but firm, because I needed to understand it myself first. Her breath hitched slightly, more emotional than she meant to be. I reached out and squeezed her hand. Upstairs, I heard Hannah pacing, short, clipped movements, her patience unraveling one thread at a time. She wasn't asking questions anymore. She was waiting for her moment. And I knew, as the technician carried in another box of equipment, that moment was coming sooner than she hoped. By the time the new furnace kicked on that evening, a low, steady rush of real warmth filling the vents, the house felt different, almost like it exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Hannah didn't come downstairs for dinner. She stayed in the bedroom, door shut, moving quietly enough to signal she was rattled. Good. But heat wasn't the only thing she'd tried to control. 2 days later, after the technician finished paperwork and Jacob left for work, I wrapped my scarf around my neck and slipped out before anyone could ask where I was going. Lee was at school, Hannah was upstairs on a work call. For once, the house didn't need watching. My first stop was the bank. It was a small brick building on Main Street, same place I'd opened my first savings account with Harold 50 years ago. The manager, Denise, recognized me instantly. She ushered me to her office with the gentle concern people use with seniors, though today I didn't mind it. I had come for clarity. "I need to see the authorization records on my utility and household payments," I told her. "All of them." Denise hesitated, then pulled up the files. What appeared on her screen made her frown deeply. "Mrs. Phillips, it looks like your daughter-in-law has been signing off as your authorized agent." I felt my stomach drop, not in shock but in confirmation. Seeing it on paper gave shape to what I'd only suspected. Multiple digital signatures, account tier changes, automatic withdrawals I hadn't approved. She told our staff she was handling things while you had trouble with memory, Denise added carefully. My fingers tightened around the armrests. I never gave her permission. I know, her voice softened, which means she never should have had access. The room felt suddenly smaller, not because I was afraid, but because I could finally see the full scope of Hannah's reach. This wasn't about heat, this was about control, plain and simple. And she had counted on my silence. Print everything, I said, every document with her name on it. By the time I left the bank, a folder thick with evidence tucked into my bag, the cold outside felt invigorating instead of bitter. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't confused. I was prepared. My next stop was Dan Avery's office, an estate lawyer with a reputation for not letting anyone push his older clients around. I'd met him once at a senior center seminar. He'd told me to call if I ever felt someone was making decisions for my convenience. He didn't expect me to walk in with a folder. As he flipped through the pages, his expression shifted from mild curiosity to anger. Maggie, he said, closing the file gently, your daughter-in-law crossed several legal lines. I thought she did. You need immediate protection, new directives, new account controls, and a trust to keep your finances out of reach. I nodded steady. Let's start. Dan drafted documents with practiced precision. When he slid the pen across the table, something inside me settled, not triumph, just certainty. I signed every page without hesitation. Maggie, he said quietly as I stood to leave, you're doing the right thing. For the first time in months, I believed him. When I returned home, Lee was sitting on the couch, textbooks open but unread. She looked up the moment I walked through the door. You were gone a long time, she said softly. I sat beside her. She noticed the folder in my hand, her eyes widening slightly. Grandma, what's happening? I didn't tell her everything, not yet, but I gave her enough. Your mother has been making decisions she shouldn't have, I said gently, so I made some of my own. Lee's throat bobbed as she swallowed, processing more than any 15-year-old should. I knew she was controlling, she whispered, but I didn't know she was hurting you. You see more than you're given credit for, I said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. She leaned against me, quiet but resolute, a silent vow. Later that evening, Gloria came over, her arms full of documents and a steel lockbox. Together, we sorted medical directives, emergency contacts, passwords, everything a person needs when trust becomes a luxury. You're rebuilding the castle, Gloria muttered approvingly, brick by brick. Yes, I said, and I'm choosing who gets through the gate. We had just finished sealing the lockbox when the front door opened. Hannah stepped in, coat still on, eyes scanning the living room and then landing on the folder from the bank. Her face drained, her jaw tightening. What, she whispered, exactly have you done? And for the first time. I didn't look away. Hannah didn't speak for nearly a full minute after asking her question. She stood there, still wearing her coat, the cold clinging to her shoulders like she'd brought the winter in with her. Her eyes darted between my face and the folder, its edges neatly aligned, every page inside it a truth she wished had stayed hidden. I simply folded the last sheet Gloria and I had been reviewing and placed it into the lockbox. Calm, unhurried, completely in control. Hannah broke first. You've been busy, she said, her voice thin, brittle at the edges, making a whole show out of nothing. It's not a show, I replied, just housekeeping. She laughed, soft, nervous, a sound that didn't reach her eyes. Well, I hope you're not wasting energy again, the bill. That's handled, I said before she could finish. Her mouth snapped shut. For the first time, she seemed unsure of where to step next. She retreated toward the stairs, her footfalls uneven, like she was walking on shifting ground. Once she was gone, I exhaled slowly and picked up the phone. This time, when I called the utility company, I asked for an accounts specialist, the same one who'd flagged the unusual restrictions earlier in the week. I requested an official statement showing the unauthorized changes. I didn't use Hannah's name. I didn't need to. The representative understood immediately and promised to send a formal report by the next day. The moment I hung up, I opened my notebook, flipping to a fresh page. Dates, statements, actions, evidence. Every change Hannah had made, every time she'd dismissed my concerns, every document she'd signed. I didn't write with anger, I wrote with clarity. If Hannah wanted control, she was about to see what control actually looked like. Later in the afternoon, Lee drifted into the living room with her homework but didn't open it. She curled herself into the armchair across from me, tucking her knees under a blanket. She watched me write, her eyes soft, steady. "You're different lately," she said, more sure. "I needed to be," I answered. She nodded like she understood something deeper than the words themselves. She stayed with me for hours, occasionally asking questions about her schoolwork, mostly just keeping me company. The house felt warmer with her nearby in a way no furnace could replicate. Hannah passed through the room twice, her gaze bouncing between us. Lee didn't acknowledge her. That shift wasn't lost on anyone. By evening, I'd made calls to a locksmith, ordered new fire extinguishers, and requested updated paperwork from my insurance provider. They were small things but strategic changes that made the house feel more like mine again. And each one seemed to scrape against Hannah's patience like sandpaper. At dinner, she prodded Jacob with subtle jabs disguised as conversation. "Your mother's making all kinds of changes. She's overreacting. It's unnecessary." Jacob shrugged, unaware of the weight behind her words. "Let her do what she wants. She's just reorganizing." Hannah shot me a look over the table, a warning wrapped in irritation. I only took another sip of soup and smiled politely. After dinner, Jacob lingered in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, his brow furrowed slightly. "Mom, is everything all right? You've been busy." "Everything is fine," I said. "Some things needed attention." He hesitated, clearly wanting more clarity but unwilling to push. "Okay, just tell me if you need help, all right?" "I will," I lied gently. Because help was not something he was prepared to give, not the kind I needed. Later that night, as I locked away the day's paperwork in the steel box, the hallway light flicked on. Hannah stood at the end of the corridor, her expression sharper than it had been all day. "You're planning something," she said quietly. "I can feel it." I closed the lockbox with a soft click. "I'm planning to take care of myself," I replied. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. She just stared, calculating, unsettled, aware she was losing ground she never should have claimed. And then she asked, voice barely above a whisper, "What else are you hiding?" I didn't answer. Because tomorrow, she'd find out exactly how much. I waited until the house settled into that late morning stillness. Jacob gone, Hannah clattering through chores upstairs, Lee at school but texting me little check-ins like she sensed the day might need steadiness. At the kitchen table, sunlight fell across the wood in a narrow stripe, warming only a thin slice of space. It felt like permission, enough to write what needed to be written. I opened a fresh sheet of stationery. No email, no whispered conversation, a letter, something solid, undeniable. The words came easily, not sharp or vengeful, just clear. I listed the steps I'd taken, securing my accounts, requesting the official utility statement, updating my directives. I detailed what Hannah no longer had authority to touch, and I ended with a line I knew she would hate for its simplicity. "My decisions are my own now." When I folded it, the paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with consequence, not anger. I slipped it under her bedroom door. It didn't take long. Not 20 minutes later, Hannah's voice sliced through the hallway. "Jacob, you need to see this." Her footsteps thundered down the stairs, the letter fluttering in her fist like a captured flag. Jacob emerged from the garage, wiping his hands on an old shop towel. He blinked in confusion when she shoved the pages at him. "She's making all these changes," Hannah snapped, "behind our backs." Jacob skimmed the letter, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something quieter, something thoughtful. "Maggie," he said slowly, turning to me, "is all this true?" I met his eyes, every word. Hannah scoffed, folding her arms tight across her chest. "She's exaggerating. None of this was necessary." "It was," I said softly. Jacob held the letter like it burned. "Hannah, did you really change Mom's accounts without talking to her?" A flush crept up her neck, anger or guilt, I couldn't tell. She didn't need to be bothered with details, I was keeping it simple. "Simple for who?" he asked. Her silence was answer enough. For a moment, Jacob's gaze lingered on me longer than usual, weighted with a dawning awareness he'd avoided for years, a small crack in the facade of harmony he'd always preferred. Hannah noticed it too. She snatched the letter back from him, shaking her head. "This is just overreaction, she's being dramatic, that's all." Before I could reply, the front door opened and Lee stepped inside, her cheeks pink from the cold. She froze when she saw the tension hanging in the air. "What's going on?" she asked. Hannah forced a tense smile. "Your grandmother thinks she needs to take over everything." Lee looked at me instead. "Grandma." I nodded. "I'm just making sure I'm the one deciding what happens to me." Lee didn't hesitate. "Good." Hannah blinked, stunned by the quick allegiance. Jacob stared at his daughter, something tightening behind his eyes, recognition maybe that the next generation saw what he'd chosen not to. Lee stepped to my side and placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice steady. "If you ever want help with anything, you can ask me. I won't let anyone take decisions from you again." The maturity in her tone cut through the room. It embarrassed Hannah, it moved Jacob, and it strengthened something inside me that had been dormant for far too long. "I know," I told her. "Thank you." After Hannah stormed out, slamming the mudroom door hard enough to rattle the shelf, I returned to the kitchen and pulled my planner from the drawer. Tomorrow's appointment with Dan Avery was already circled, but I added a note beneath it. "Finalize will, finalize trust, finalize everything." The house grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that settles after a truth has finally been spoken aloud. Jacob hovered in the doorway, unsure, conflicted. "Mom," he began, "I didn't know she'd done all that. I should've." "You'll see things clearly when you're ready," I said gently. He nodded, then stepped back, as if giving me space he hadn't realized I'd needed. By early evening, I had gathered every document I would bring to Dan's office. Birth certificate, deed copies, beneficiary lists, my life distilled into crisp sheets of paper. As I zipped the folder shut, I noticed something on the hallway floor. The letter crumpled, torn slightly at the edge. Hannah had dropped it on her way out. Or maybe she meant for me to see it, meant for me to know she wasn't done. Either way, I picked it up, smoothed the creases, and placed it back in the drawer. This wasn't over. And tomorrow, my signature would make sure of it. Jacob found me the next morning at the dining table, sorting documents into neat piles, legal, medical, financial. He paused in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he was interrupting surgery. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk before you leave for your meeting?" I gestured to the chair across from me. "Of course." He sat heavily, elbows on his knees, studying the paperwork with a tight brow. "I didn't realize you'd planned this much." "I had to," I said. "Waiting for someone else to fix things wasn't working." He rubbed his palms together, absorbing the truth with the hesitance of a man who'd spent years avoiding conflict. "But a trust, account protections, emergency directives?" He shook his head slowly. "I had no idea you were thinking this far ahead." "I wasn't," I admitted, "not until it became clear someone else was thinking ahead for me." His eyes flickered, hurt, then dawning understanding. Before he could respond, Hannah swept into the room, hair styled, coat already on despite nowhere to be. She scanned the table and let out a tight exhale. "Oh good," she said, voice coated in false brightness. "Another meeting about how I've ruined everyone's life." Jacob's shoulders tensed. "Hannah." "No," she continued, stepping closer, "I'm not the villain here. I've been managing things because your mother can't do all this alone." Her gaze landed on me. "You don't realize how much work you've been." There it was, the word she'd been circling for weeks. A burden. I sat straighter, folding a document with deliberate calm. "I'm not a burden, Hannah, and I'm not helpless. I'm simply choosing to make my own decisions." Her jaw tightened. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "Signing my name without permission isn't a proportion to measure," I replied. "It's a violation." Jacob's head snapped toward her. "Is that true?" She deflected instantly. I was trying to help, someone had to. She gets confused, Jacob. She forgets bills. I forget nothing, I said, my voice cutting through hers. And even if I did, that still wouldn't give you the right to take control. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Lee, who had been lingering by the kitchen entryway, stepped into the room. Her expression held none of her mother's panic, only quiet certainty. Grandma doesn't forget things, she said softly. She notices everything. Hannah turned startled. Lee, stay out of this. No, Lee said, stepping closer to me. I want to hear what she's planning. It's her life. I touched Lee's hand. Everything I'm doing is to make sure you never worry about me being taken advantage of again. She nodded, her eyes bright with something between relief and pride. Jacob cleared his throat, his voice lower now. Mom, you really don't want us involved in these decisions anymore. I want involvement, I said gently, not control and certainly not manipulation. Hannah stiffened, her face paling. So what, am I supposed to pretend none of this matters, pretend you don't need oversight? I met her gaze with quiet resolve. I need respect, Hannah, that's all, and from now on you will not decide anything for me, not utilities, not money, not care, nothing. Her lips parted in a silent protest, but no words came out. Jacob leaned back slowly, absorbing the scene with a heaviness I hadn't seen in him since Harold died. I could see the questions piling behind his eyes, the cracks widening where trust and denial had been patched together. I need a moment, he murmured, rising from the table. He disappeared into the hallway, the weight of what he'd learned settling on his shoulders. Hannah watched him go, panic flickering beneath her anger. And for the first time, she realized she might not have Jacob to hide behind anymore. The letter arrived on a Thursday, cold morning, gray sky, the kind that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. I found it in the mailbox tucked between grocery flyers and a medical reminder card. The utility company's logo sat crisp in the upper corner, printed in winter blue ink. I knew what it was before I opened it. Inside, the house was unusually quiet. Jacob had left early, still wrestling with yesterday's conversation, and Hannah was upstairs, shutting drawers a little too loudly, her way of reminding everyone she was still there. Lee was at the kitchen counter finishing a school project, the tip of her pencil tapping anxiously. I set the envelope on the table. She noticed immediately. Is that the report you asked for? Yes, I said, it is. I didn't rush. I slid a finger under the seal, unfolded the letter slowly, deliberately. Lee leaned in but didn't speak. The company's apology came first, printed in formal, unmistakable language. We regret to inform you that several unauthorized account modifications were made under your profile. Lee sucked in a breath. Including service tier restrictions, billing overrides, and emergency response priority changes that were approved by an individual not listed as an authorized decision maker. My stomach tightened, not in fear, but in a bitter recognition of what I'd known all along. The X lines were bolder, firmer. We sincerely apologize for any harm or discomfort caused by these actions. The individual involved did not have the legal authority to act on your behalf. And finally, your account has now been restored to full rights under your name only. I set the letter down. Footsteps sounded from the stairs. Hannah appeared at the bottom, arms full of folded laundry, pausing when she saw the two of us over the document. What's that? She asked too casually. Before I could answer, Lee lifted the page and held it toward her. Mom, you should read this. Hannah didn't move at first, then she stepped forward, face stiffening as her eyes scanned the words. She blinked once, twice, the color drained from her cheeks. That's exaggerated, she muttered. You're misinterpreting it. No, Lee whispered. They're saying you weren't allowed to do any of it. Hannah's eyes darted to me, searching for accusation, but I offered none. I only held her gaze steady, unmoving. Silence can sometimes speak louder than any outburst. Jacob walked in at that exact moment, snow still dusting his shoulders. He stopped when he saw the tension, the letter, the way Hannah looked cornered. What's going on now? He asked. Lee handed him the paper. Dad, read this. He did, and the confusion on his face shifted into something far heavier. His jaw tightened as he reached the part about unauthorized modifications, then the apology, then the confirmation that I had been improperly overridden. Han, he said quietly, tell me this isn't what it looks like. She lifted her chin in defiance, but her voice faltered. I was trying to manage things, someone had to. Your mother doesn't understand how complicated these bills are. Jacob stared at her, and for the first time I saw the truth land not as a single blow but as a slow collapse of everything he thought she'd been doing out of kindness. You changed her emergency response status, he said, voice cracking. Why would you do that? I didn't think it mattered, she stammered. She never even notices half of. I stepped in softly. I notice more than you think. The room fell into a hush, so deep it felt like the house was listening. Lee moved to my side, her hand brushing my arm, not for comfort but solidarity. Dad, she said, this isn't the first thing Mom did without asking. Hannah spun toward her. Hey, don't start repeating things you don't understand. I understand enough, Lee replied, firm but calm. I see how Grandma lives, I see who actually listens to her. The statement hit harder than any accusation could have. Jacob exhaled a long, defeated sound. Hannah, you crossed a line. Hannah's eyes filled with panic, but her voice rose in frantic defense. I was just trying to help, she'd be freezing without me, she'd. I held up the letter. This says otherwise. The last thread of denial snapped. Hannah's face twisted, not in sorrow, but in the shock of someone realizing their version of the story no longer holds power. And then, without another word, she grabbed her coat and stormed out the back door, the slam echoing through the house like a warning. Jacob sank into a chair, rubbing both hands over his face. Lee looked at me, eyes wide. Grandma, what happens now? I folded the letter, smoothed the edges, and set it neatly on the table. Now, I said, we let the truth do what it always does. But privately, I knew this revelation wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of Hannah unraveling. And she wasn't going to go quietly. Hannah didn't come home that night. Jacob kept checking the driveway as if her headlights might suddenly sweep across the yard, but the hours passed quietly. By morning, the tension had settled into the walls like residue. When the knock finally came, it was Hannah. It was Caleb. He hovered on the porch, mid-40s, thin, his work badge still clipped to his jacket. He'd visited their house once or twice before, helping Hannah organize the online accounts. At the time, he seemed harmless, a coworker with too much free time and too many opinions on budgeting. Now he wouldn't meet my eyes. Mrs. Phillips, he murmured, I think we should talk. Jacob opened the door wider, confused but stepping aside. Lee stayed near me, arms crossed, expression already wary. Caleb stepped inside like a man entering a courtroom. He clasped his hands. I didn't know it would go this far. I said nothing. Silence has a way of making truth come faster. He swallowed. Hannah asked me to help with your accounts last fall. She said you weren't keeping up. I thought I was doing her a favor, just setting up autopay, adjusting the billing tiers, moving some things around so she could manage it for you. Jacob stiffened. You changed her accounts. Caleb flinched at the tone. She insisted she had authorization. She said you were all on the same page. Jacob shook his head slowly, realization sinking in like cement. We were. Caleb looked at me then, finally, and his face tightened. I saw the letter she got yesterday. I didn't know she went behind legal permissions. I shouldn't have trusted her word. I reached for the folder on the table, slid out the printed signatures, highlighted changes, timestamps. I placed it in front of him. These, I said softly, are yours. His shoulders collapsed under the weight of the papers. I'm sorry, he whispered. I shouldn't have touched any of it. The apology fell flat, not because he didn't mean it, but because it arrived months late and miles short of repair. I didn't respond with comfort, not anger either, just a steady, measured calm. What's done is documented, I said. That's all that matters now. Footsteps sounded at the back door. Hannah entered, hair disheveled, coat half-buttoned, eyes red but not from regret, more from exhaustion and fear. She froze when she saw Caleb. Oh God, her voice cracked. You told her. He nodded. I had to. Her gaze snapped to me, panic rising. Maggie, please, you have to understand, I was trying to prevent problems before they happened. I wasn't trying to hurt you. Lee stepped forward before I could speak. You took advantage of her, she said sharply. You didn't ask, you didn't check, you just decided you knew best. Hannah's mouth trembled. Lee, sweetheart, I was just doing what any responsible adult. Responsible adults don't lie, Lee cut in. They don't change accounts, they don't freeze people out of their own home. The room stilled. Jacob looked at his daughter, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. Respect. And maybe a little shame that it took his child speaking up for him to see clearly. Hannah's voice thinned. Maggie, please, can't we just move past this, forgive each other? I stood, meeting her desperate gaze with a calm she couldn't penetrate. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I said. I'm asking for boundaries, and from now on you will not cross them. The finality in my tone changed the air around us. Even the radiator seemed to quiet. Jacob nodded once slowly. Mom's right. Caleb stepped back, sensing the verdict before it was spoken. I'll send you everything I did on the account, he murmured. Every change, every login. Do that, I said. He left without another word. Hannah looked between Jacob, Lee, and me, realizing there was no ally left to claim. No version of the story she could twist. No ground beneath her that hadn't already shifted. And just as she opened her mouth, maybe to beg, maybe to lash out, my phone buzzed loudly on the table. A message from the utility company. Your full case file has been completed. It includes actions taken by all involved parties. Please review immediately. Hannah's face went white. This time I didn't hide the screen. By the time Friday rolled around, the case file from the utility company sat neatly in my bag beside my estate documents. I arrived at Dan Avery's office early, the lobby still quiet, the winter air clinging to my coat. Dan ushered me in with a small nod of respect, no pleasantries, just the kind of acknowledgement a person gives someone who has done the hard work already. We spent an hour reviewing the final steps, sealing the trust, updating my beneficiaries, removing Hannah entirely from any role of authority. Every signature felt like stitching a torn seam, closed, slow, steady, permanent. When he slid the last document toward me, I paused, pen poised. For Lee, I said. He nodded. It will all pass to her when she comes of age, exactly as you outlined. I signed, not with fear of what had been done to me, only with clarity for what I would never allow again. When I left the office, the winter air felt different. Less like something to endure, more like something I could breathe again. The sun glinted off snowbanks as if the world was returning something I'd misplaced months ago. Control. Ownership. Dignity. Gloria was waiting for me in the kitchen when I got home, 2 mugs of hot cider steaming on the counter. She raised hers in a small toast. So, she said, grinning, is the Queen's castle officially fortified? It is, I replied, clinking my mug to hers. We sat for a moment, letting the warmth settle in our hands. The house felt open again, not because Hannah wasn't there, but because her presence no longer dictated the air. Even the furnace seemed to hum with a steadier confidence. Lee came home from school and immediately joined us, dropping her backpack in a soft thud before sliding into the seat beside me. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and she looked happier than I'd seen her in weeks. Did everything go okay today? She asked. It went exactly how it needed to, I said. She smiled, bright, relieved, and leaned her shoulder into mine. Good. We talked for a while about ordinary things, her history project, my old habit of keeping travel brochures for places I never visited, the way Harold used to dream about seeing the Rockies. Halfway through the conversation, she pulled a crumpled pamphlet from her pocket. Grandma, she said, what if we went somewhere this spring, just us, somewhere warm or somewhere beautiful, maybe both? Part of me wanted to say no out of habit, old instincts of staying put, staying quiet. But the bigger part, the part I'd been rebuilding piece by piece these past weeks, knew better. I think, I said slowly, it's time I finally left Minnesota for something other than a doctor's appointment. Her face lit with a joy so pure it softened every corner of the room. Later that evening, after Gloria left and the house settled into a comfortable hush, the phone rang. Jacob. His voice was strained but earnest. Mom, I wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you. I closed my eyes, letting his regret settle without soaking into me. You see it now, I said gently. That's enough. He exhaled on the other end, but I kept the call brief. Today wasn't about repair. Today was about foundation. After I hung up, I moved through the house, adjusting small things, tidying blankets, straightening the stack of legal folders, refilling the kettle. When I reached the front hall, something caught my eye through the window. A car I recognized. Headlights off, engine idling. Not moving. Hannah, watching the house from the curb. And in that quiet moment, one truth settled in my chest. She wasn't done. Not yet. Hannah stayed parked outside for nearly 10 minutes before finally pulling away. I watched the taillights flicker down the street, disappearing into the early evening dark. I didn't feel fear, not anymore, only a calm steadiness, like the house and I were finally breathing in sync again. The next morning, she showed up at the door. Her knock wasn't sharp, just hesitant. She stood on the front step, bundled in a long coat, eyes damp, lips pressed together in something she hoped passed for remorse. Lee was in the kitchen, pouring cereal, and glanced toward the hallway when she heard the sound. I opened the door only halfway. Maggie, Hannah began, wringing her gloves. I shouldn't have waited in the car last night. That wasn't fair, and I've been thinking a lot. I want to talk about everything. No, I said quietly. She blinked, startled. No. No more discussions about my finances, my utilities, my care, my decisions. That part of our relationship is over. She exhaled shakily, trying to gather her composure. I'm trying to apologize. And I'm acknowledging your attempt, I replied, but an apology doesn't undo boundaries, they stay. She opened her mouth again, but Lee appeared at my side, unexpected, resolute. Mom, she said, her voice steady, Grandma's serious, she's done. The two of them held each other's gaze for a tense moment that felt like the end of a long, toxic chapter. Eventually, with no foothold left, Hannah stepped back from the door. Her expression wasn't anger anymore, it was resignation. I guess I'll check in with Jacob, she muttered. That would be best, I said. I closed the door softly, not slammed, not dramatic, just final. Over the next week, the house shifted from a battleground back into a home. I dusted shelves that had been neglected, opened curtains that had lived mostly closed, and let Lee help me reorganize the office so documents were accessible only to us. She took to the role naturally, asking smart questions, listening carefully. She wasn't just helping. She was learning. One afternoon, while we sorted mail, she glanced over and said, You know, Grandma, I like this, being part of your decisions, not for you, just with you. I squeezed her hand. That's exactly how I want it. The furnace purred contentedly through the walls, the house finally holding heat the way it should. For the first winter in years, I didn't double up blankets at night. The quiet was no longer cold. It was peaceful. I started hosting small dinners again, nothing extravagant, just soups and cornbread, the kind of meals Harold would have loved. Gloria joined most evenings, and Lee often stayed, doing homework at the table while I chopped onions or stirred pots. Music played softly. Laughter returned in cautious TLE bursts. Jacob stopped by more frequently too, not with excuses or explanations, just with tools, fixing loose door hinges, touching up paint I couldn't reach, replacing old batteries in the smoke detectors. He didn't make speeches about understanding now, he showed it. Once, while tightening a cabinet handle, he murmured, I should have asked more questions. You're asking them now, I said. We left it at that. Near the end of the week, Hannah returned, not at the door this time, but in the backyard while I was shaking crumbs off the tablecloth. She stood near the fence, arms wrapped around herself. Maggie, she said softly, I really am sorry. I heard you the first time, I replied, but nothing about the boundaries has changed. Her face wavered, like she'd expected at least a crack in the door. So there really isn't a way back. There's a way forward, I said, just not the way you're used to. She nodded stiffly, turning to leave. But before she reached the gate, she paused and added, too casual, too controlled. You might want to check the mail tomorrow, something important should arrive. Then she walked away. I watched until she disappeared behind the neighbor's shed. And for the first time in days, a cold prickle ran up my spine. What had she set in motion? This time, it was an afternoon like any other when I saw them, the last two people who had ever controlled anything in this house, driving down the street, their car packed with bags and boxes. Hannah and Caleb, neither of them looked back as they made their way down the road. Hannah's car had always been sleek, always an extension of her precision, nothing too flashy, just a polished vessel of control. Now it looked like a last breath, the kind that rattles but never quite leaves. I stood at the window, watching them until the car disappeared around the bend, my hand resting lightly on the windowsill. It wasn't the relief of victory nor the joy of freedom that settled in my chest. It was finality. For years, the weight of her influence had pressed against the walls of this house, curling around every decision I made, turning even the smallest choices into battles. But now, it was over. Her presence, the power she wielded, the manipulation, all of it was gone. Lee appeared beside me, her soft steps barely making a sound. She didn't need to ask what I was feeling. "It's over, right?" Her voice was quiet, almost unsure. I met her eyes, my smile steady, confident. "It's just beginning, darling." She didn't need an explanation. She just nodded, stepping closer and resting her head against my arm. The weight of her small body was a comfort, a reminder of why this had all mattered. For her, for us, not just for me but for the legacy I could leave behind. A legacy built on trust, independence, and strength. We stood there for a long moment, watching the space where Hannah had been, knowing that this house, this life, was ours again. The house, for all its quiet, was fuller than it had ever been. The phone rang, cutting through the stillness. It was the utility company, confirming what I had already known in my bones. Their voice on the other end was polite, professional, and final. "We've reviewed everything, Mrs. Phillips. All systems are properly set and secured under your name. Your account is now fully restored with no further restrictions. You're in full control." I nodded even though they couldn't see me, a small, private victory. When I hung up, Lee was already sitting at the table, pulling out a map and spreading it across the kitchen's surface. She ran her fingers over the faded lines, eyes lighting up as she traced potential routes with excited energy. "Grandma," she said, looking up, "let's go on that trip, just us, no distractions, no more waiting." For a moment, I could see it, everything we had talked about, all those dreams that had slipped away, now coming into focus. We could go anywhere, we could do anything. I smiled as I knelt beside her, my fingers brushing the map. Where to then? Lee's finger hovered over the map for a second, then landed on a distant spot, a place neither of us had been before. "Here," she said, her voice full of wonder, "somewhere new." I reached for a pencil, marking the spot. "Somewhere new," I repeated softly. It wasn't just the place that mattered, it was the act of choosing it for ourselves. A place untouched by anyone else's expectations, a future that would always be ours to claim. I stood back, looking at the room, at the empty spaces that had once felt like they were too filled with someone else's choices. And just before I turned away, I glanced at the front door one last time, feeling that same quiet sense of release. Hannah was gone, Caleb too, and with them all the fear, the manipulation, and the weight of being controlled. The future now belonged to me, and to Lee. For the first time, I was truly free. With the last of Hannah's presence fading down the street, I walked back inside, feeling a lightness in the air that hadn't been there for years. The house was quiet now, but it was a different kind of quiet, not empty, not cold, just open. I moved to the thermostat, my fingers hovering for a moment over the dial before turning it up. The furnace clicked to life with a low hum, and warmth started to flow back through the rooms, slow at first, like a breath of spring after a long winter. The kind of warmth that feels earned, that says it's time to breathe. I stood in the center of the living room, watching as the air in the house began to change. The shadows softened, and for the first time in years, it felt like the house was truly mine again. I crossed the room to the window, tugging the heavy, dark curtains open. The sunlight spilled in, filling every corner, pushing out the memories of silence and control that had taken root in the dark. The light felt like a gift, like the house was breathing again with me. Lee wandered into the room, a quiet joy in her step. She looked up at the space that had once been cluttered with uncertainty, and her eyes glowed with something new. "Grandma, can I paint the hallway?" I turned, raising an eyebrow. "Paint?" She nodded eagerly. "Yeah, a map, a big one, of everywhere we'll go so we can always know where we're headed." I looked at her for a long moment, her energy, her excitement, how it had been so carefully hidden under the weight of things she couldn't control. "Of course you can," I said, smiling softly. She hurried to gather supplies, a sparkle in her eyes that had been dimmed for too long. She wasn't just painting a wall, she was marking out a new future. As I watched her begin, I felt the pull of change in the air. It was more than just the sunlight or the warmth filling the space, it was the feeling of finally filling the house with us. No more hiding, no more silence. Later, I picked up the phone and made a call. It had been too long since the house had seen life beyond just the two of us. It had been far too long since I'd hosted a meal, invited friends in to fill the air with stories and laughter. "Gloria," I said when she picked up, "it's time, a small dinner, just us, a few others. It's time to fill this house with more than just quiet." She didn't even need to ask twice. "I'll bring the wine," she said with a laugh. And I knew it was exactly what the house needed, what we needed. Jacob arrived later that afternoon, unannounced, standing at the door with a box of light bulbs in hand. He stood there for a moment, unsure of himself. The awkwardness between us was still there, but it was no longer the dominant force in the room. It wasn't us anymore. "Need help with repairs?" he asked. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "The house is yours too," I said, "but only if you respect it and me." He looked at me for a long beat, the unspoken weight of our past hanging between us, before he nodded. "I will." The awkwardness remained, but it was a beginning. He helped with a few light fixtures and patched a couple of cracks that had been ignored for too long. There was no longer any expectation of apologies or explanations, just the quiet understanding that the house, this home, was no longer under anyone's shadow but my own. That evening, as I set the table, the doorbell rang. Gloria arrived with a smile wide enough to stretch the whole room. The table filled with conversation, the smell of garlic and rosemary, the warmth of laughter. Lee smiled as she painted, her map of places we'd go, growing bigger by the minute. The silence Hannah once cast here had been replaced by something I'd almost forgotten could exist: joy. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years I was no longer waiting for permission to live. I was living. And no one would take that from me again. The sky was crisp that morning, clear and sharp, with a touch of frost still clinging to the branches. I walked through the neighborhood, the ground crackling underfoot, the cold air biting but refreshing. Every breath felt cleansing, as if the universe was reminding me that I could still fill my lungs with something that was all mine. I had thought about walking these streets many times before, but it was always with a weight in my chest, the sense that I was walking under a shadow. Now the world was wide open. My feet seemed to fall into rhythm with my thoughts. The old oak tree at the corner was still standing tall, its gnarled branches tracing the sky like a slow, deliberate dance. The houses were the same, weathered, familiar, but somehow lighter now. The weight had shifted. It wasn't just the house or the walls or even the old furnace that hummed behind me. It was me. I'd finally started making decisions, and for the first time they were my decisions. As I walked, I let myself think about the future, the life I would build and the life I already had. A life filled with small joys, quiet mornings with Lee, conversations over dinner that didn't have tea. Oh, be guarded, no more subtle compromises, no more silent fights, just choices made with confidence, each one a small brick in the house I had rebuilt. Lee's face came to me, her eyes always full of possibility. She had been the spark, the reason I fought so hard for this piece. The afternoons she spent with me, drawing, planning our next adventure, those moments had become our anchor. Together, we made decisions, not out of necessity but out of joy. We weren't just existing in the space, we were living in it. When I returned home, the house felt even warmer than before. There was a hum of activity in the kitchen. Gloria had dropped by to help with a batch of bread, the scent of yeast and flour filling the space. Lee was sitting at the table, sketching ideas for the mural that was slowly taking shape in the hallway, a map, like she'd promised, of places we were going to visit. "Grandma," Lee said, looking up as I stepped inside, "I think I want to add a sunset here." She gestured toward the far corner of the wall. Perfect, I said, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. A sunset it is. It was moments like this that made everything feel real whole. It was no longer about surviving, it was about living. No more waiting, no more hesitating. This was ours to enjoy fully and without hesitation. Later, as the day drifted to an easy close, the phone rang. It was the utility company again, checking in one final time. The call was routine, polite, professional, just making sure everything was in order. I could hear the slight click of a keyboard on the other end as they confirmed what I already knew. "We've reviewed everything, Mrs. Phillips," the voice said. "All systems are working perfectly, your account is in full order and there are no further issues." I exhaled, "Thank you, it's done." It felt like the last piece of the puzzle had been locked into place. I didn't need them to reassure me anymore. I knew the work was done, I'd taken control, and now it was time to live it. Lee's excitement about our trip hadn't worn off. If anything, it grew brighter as the days passed. We packed our bags together, the car loaded with snacks, maps, and the anticipation of the road ahead. The countryside was calling, 1,000 miles of open road and possibility. When we finally hit the road, the world stretched out before us. The sun was low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. We sang along to old songs, laughed until our stomachs ached, and talked about everything and nothing. The windows were down and the wind smelled of pine and earth, fresh and untouched. "This is it, Grandma," Lee said, her eyes shining. "This is what freedom feels like, huh?" I smiled at her, my heart full. "Yes, darling, this is it." We drove into the night, the stars unfolding above us like a blanket. The road ahead was ours to navigate. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't looking behind. I wasn't waiting for something to break. In the end, you can freeze or thaw. I chose to warm the world around me.